Imagine you are just a teenage girl in the 1630s.
Right. Which is already a pretty tough
Oh,
situation.
absolutely. But imagine the dense forests around you are actively being contested by warring empires. And European diseases are wiping out neighboring villages at this terrifying rate.
Just completely devastating the population.
Yeah, and on top of all that, your parents have just decided to hand you over to a foreign colonist.
Which, I mean, on the surface, that sounds like an absolute tragedy, right?
Totally. It sounds like giving up.
But for Marie-Olivier Silvestre Manitouabeouich, it was actually kind of the ultimate geopolitical power move.
It really was. Welcome to this deep dive, everyone. Today, we are taking you back to a time before Quebec even had stone streets. We're looking at the story of just an extraordinary Indigenous woman.
Right, someone who was placed squarely at the center of a clash between two completely different civilizations.
And instead of being crushed by that pressure, she learned how to navigate both sides. We're going to explore how her life forged this crucial alliance between Algonquin and French cultures.
And how she essentially became a founding matriarch of modern Canadian family history.
Exactly. And just so you know where we're getting all this, we are pulling from two main sources today. We've got a really detailed historical essay on the dynamics of early New France and the exhaustive genealogical compilations of Gail Morin.
Yeah, specifically her work documenting the first Métis families of Quebec. It is incredibly detailed.
It really is. So let's just set the scene. The world Marie-Olivier was born into around 1624 was incredibly precarious.
Oh, that was a powder keg. I mean, her parents were Roch Manitouabeouich, who was of Algonquin descent, and Ochibahanakui, who was Huron.
And the sources point out something really fascinating about her family name right off the bat. The word Manitou derives from the Algonquin concept of a powerful spiritual being, or like a sacred life force.
Right, which is a big deal. It indicates her family held a deeply respected, very significant status within their community.
They were leaders,
Mhm.
and they were leading a society that was facing, well, unprecedented existential threats.
To put it mildly, the St. Lawrence Valley in the 1620s was just unbelievably tense. The French trading posts at Quebec were essentially just, a handful of drafty wooden buildings clinging to the riverbank.
They had barely been there for 20 years, right?
Exactly, less than 20 years. Meanwhile, alliances between the French, the Algonquin, the Innu, and the Wendat peoples were in this constant, fragile state of negotiation.
Because everyone is just trying to control the flow of the fur trade.
Yeah, the fur trade was the absolute lifeblood of the colonial economy at that point.
And hovering over all of this economic tension is this very real, lethal threat from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy.
Right, who many people might know as the Iroquois.
Yeah, and they were rapidly expanding their territory to secure their own access to the fur trade. Plus, they had powerful alliances with the Dutch and the English down to the south.
Which meant they were heavily armed, they had guns, and the Algonquin and the French were directly in their way.
So it's like a high-stakes geopolitical chessboard. Every move is fundamentally about survival, and this wasn't just a border dispute.
No, not at all. It was a fight for complete regional dominance. And as if the military pressure wasn't enough to deal with, you have European epidemics tearing through the indigenous populations.
It's just hard to even fathom the scale of it. Diseases like smallpox and measles.
Yeah, diseases the indigenous peoples had zero immunity to. We're talking about wiping out up to half the population in some communities within a matter of years.
Half the village disappears in a single winter. You have heavily armed enemies closing in on your hunting grounds. Your strategy for survival just has to adapt immediately.
You don't have a choice. Which brings us directly to her parents' decision.
Right, the decision to hand her over.
Exactly. While she was still a young girl, they entrusted her to the household of a French interpreter named Olivier Le Tardif.
And he was a major player, right, like one of Samuel de Champlain's top guys.
He was. And, to our modern ears, giving your child to a foreign political operative sounds desperate, maybe even neglectful.
Right, like you're just abandoning your kid.
But within the framework of indigenous diplomacy at the time, it was a highly calculated, respected tradition. This was the practice of fostering.
Okay, so it's like you exchange people to guarantee a treaty.
Essentially, yes. You weave your families together. But placing a high-status child in the home of a prominent French official, her parents were cementing a political and social bond.
It's an insurance policy for mutual survival.
Exactly. And Le Tardif recognized her intelligence very early on. So in 1639, he arranged for her to be educated by the newly founded Ursuline nuns in Quebec.
Which is a huge deal because that makes her one of the very first Indigenous students in North America.
It does. It's a major historical milestone.
But okay, I have to push back on this narrative a little bit.
Okay, go for it.
Because when we look at the broader scope of colonial history, saying an Indigenous child got a quote-unquote education usually meant brutal forced assimilation.
Oh, absolutely. The boarding school system.
Right, where the explicit goal was to erase the child's identity entirely. So why should we believe the Ursuline experience back in 1639 was any different?
It's a totally fair question. And the answer really comes down to leverage. The power dynamics in 1639 New France were fundamentally different from what we see in the 19th or 20th centuries.
Because the French were still weak.
Extremely weak. The French colonists were vastly outnumbered, they were freezing, and they were entirely dependent on their indigenous allies just to survive the winter.
So they were in no position to force assimilation on anybody.
Right, exactly. They couldn't afford to anger her family. The Ursulines certainly taught her spoken French, Christian theology, and, European domestic management.
And she was baptized, right?
Yes, she was baptized with the French names Marie-Olivier and Silvestre. But she was treated much more like a visiting diplomat in training than a captive.
Wow. Okay. So the French needed her as much, if not more, than her community needed the French.
Yeah, and the sources make a crucial distinction here. She did not abandon her indigenous identity.
She just added to it.
Precisely. She was learning the operating system of the French colonists, but she retained her Algonquin worldview, her language, and all her inherent cultural knowledge.
So she's navigating both worlds simultaneously. She becomes this perfect human bridge between two realities.
A bridge that becomes very formalized on paper on November 3rd, 1644.
Right, at Notre Dame de Quebec. Marie-Olivier marries a French settler from Normandy named Martin Prevost.
And this is a massive milestone in the historical record. Historians widely consider this to be the first fully documented Christian marriage between a French colonist and an indigenous woman in New France.
And again, this wasn't just a romance. It was a profound strategic alliance.
Very strategic.
I mean, think of this marriage like a high-stakes venture capital investment in a modern tech startup.
Oh, I like that analogy.
You have two completely different entities joining forces, and they're bringing very different proprietary assets to the table.
Right, because the French settlers were entirely out of their depth in the Canadian wilderness.
Yeah.
They desperately needed indigenous knowledge.
They needed to know how to travel the rivers, how to hunt in deep snow.
How to navigate local diplomacy so they didn't get wiped out.
Exactly. And on the flip side, the Indigenous allies gained a permanent familial tie to European trade goods, plus crucial military cooperation against the Haudenosaunee.
It expanded their social network in a very tangible way, and the colonial authorities recognized the absolute necessity of this union.
They practically sponsored it, right?
They did. They actually gifted the newlyweds livestock, specifically cattle and swine, which was a huge rarity at the time.
So going back to the startup analogy, the French crown was essentially acting as the venture capitalist.
Yeah, providing the seed funding.
Right. They provide the proprietary technology, the livestock, in exchange for this couple acting as a hybrid research and development lab.
That's a great way to put it. The authorities wanted to see if French farming and indigenous survival skills could successfully merge.
To create an agricultural model that wouldn't fail in this brutal climate.
Because if this couple couldn't make it work, the entire colonial project was at risk of starving to death.
The stakes were literal life and death. So the couple moves out to Beauport.
Yes, which was one of the earliest agricultural communities established just outside the protective walls of Quebec.
And the sources paint a picture of daily life at Beauport that is genuinely harrowing. I mean, we are talking about clearing dense, old-growth northeastern forests completely by hand.
Just massive ancient trees.
Yeah, and you're trying to break soil that has never seen a plow using primitive iron tools.
All while racing against this agonizingly brief growing season. Yeah. The physical toll is hard to overstate.
I bet. Because Martin Prevost, he knew how to plow a field in Normandy.
Right, where the climate is temperate and the soil has been turned for centuries.
But in Beauport, his traditional French agricultural timelines were totally useless.
Completely. If you plant your wheat based on a French calendar, the Canadian frost will destroy your entire yield before it can even be harvested.
So this is what I really want to ask you about. How exactly did Marie-Olivier's Algonquin knowledge keep this family from freezing and starving during those first isolated winters? Like, what were the actual mechanics of her survival strategy?
Well, it really came down to a deep generational understanding of the local biome. When the European crops inevitably struggled, she knew exactly how to pivot.
She had a backup plan.
She had centuries of backup plans. She understood the local seasonal rhythms of the forest. For example, scurvy was a massive killer for early colonists.
Oh, yeah, because they relied on salted meats and had zero fresh produce through the winter.
Exactly. But Marie-Olivier would have known how to harvest the needles and bark of the white cedar tree,
Okay, to do what with it?
to brew a specific tea, often called Anita by the locals, which is packed with vitamin C and basically cures scurvy almost overnight.
Wow. So that is a piece of medical knowledge that literally saves the entire operation.
It really does. And beyond medicine, she knew the mechanics of food preservation in a deep freeze. You can't just leave meat out in the Canadian winter.
Right, it attracts predators or it rots during a sudden thaw.
Exactly. She understood how to properly smoke local game or process it into pemmican.
Pemmican, that's like a survival superfood, right?
Yeah, it's a highly caloric mixture of dried meat, rendered fat, and sometimes berries. And that could sustain the family through the leanest, most desperate months of February and March when the winter stores ran low.
So it was a daily, grueling integration of French agriculture and Algonquin survival strategy. She's literally pulling the best tools from both civilizations just to put dinner on the table.
Just to keep her kids alive. But, despite all of this incredible resilience, the era was still profoundly tragic.
Yeah, we have to talk about the harsh reality of the frontier.
The infant mortality rate was devastating. Disease, periodic food shortages, the sheer physical toll of the environment. It meant that Marie-Olivier and Martin lost several of their children in infancy and early childhood.
Oh, that is just heartbreaking.
It was a crushing reality, but it was shared by almost every family trying to establish a foothold in New France at the time.
It's a very stark reminder that this wasn't some romantic, fun pioneer adventure. It was a vicious fight for existence.
But despite that unimaginable heartbreak, their family line did survive. Marie-Olivier died on September 10th, 1665.
She was still so young, only about 41 years old.
Yeah, only 41. But the timing of her death is highly symbolic. She passes away just as the famous Carignan-Salieres regiment is arriving in the colony.
And for context for you listening, this regiment was the first deployment of regular professional troops sent directly by King Louis XIV.
Right, sent specifically to secure the colony against the Haudenosaunee.
So their arrival marks a massive shift. New France is suddenly transforming from this fragile, desperate frontier outpost into a fortified, permanent royal province.
Exactly. Marie-Olivier spent her entire life navigating the most dangerous, unstable decades of the colony. And she dies right at the exact moment the society she helped build finally becomes secure.
It's almost poetic. And it's wild because she didn't leave behind any personal journals. Her voice isn't captured in a diary anywhere.
No, we don't have letters from her.
But her choices and her legacy survive in the parish registers, in the legal documents of the era, and most importantly, in the actual bloodline she established.
Right, and this is where Gail Moran's genealogical work is just so vital. It provides the mathematical proof of Marie-Olivier's impact.
It's all right there in the records.
It is. Moran's compilations trace how Marie-Olivier and Martin's surviving children, including Jean-Baptiste, Louis, and Thérèse, carried forward both their French and Algonquin ancestries.
Marrying into other early families and just expanding their reach across the entire continent.
Exactly.
Instead of just reading a dry list of names on a chart, looking at this genealogy is like watching a massive river system form from a single powerful spring.
I love that. You can literally trace the resilience required on that farm in Beauport as it flows forward through time.
Yeah, so let's actually trace it. Let's follow just one specific current from the sources to see how this history reaches the present day.
Okay, let's do it. So from Marie-Olivier and Martin, the line moves to their son, Jean-Baptiste Prévost. He survives the frontier to have a daughter, Marie-Louise.
And from Marie-Louise, the family tree branches out into the Silhouette family, leading down to Marie-Catherine Silhouette.
Right. And with each generation, these descendants are adapting to the changing landscape of North America.
Surviving the shift from French to British rule, navigating the Industrial Revolution, moving across new borders.
Yeah, so the line flows through Marguerite Rognon-Laroche down to Marguerite Lamontagne, and eventually it reaches Julia Ann Perea.
And Julia Ann Perea brings us right to the threshold of modern history. She was the mother of Arnedia Carter, who went by Minnie.
And Minnie's son, Nelson Aaron Perea, represents the 20th century.
It's crazy to think about. When you trace this unbroken line from an Algonquin village in the 1620s through the halls of a French convent to a brutally cold farm in Beauport, all the way down to Nelson Aaron Peria and the thousands of descendants alive today, it just completely reframes how we view the founding of a nation.
It really does. The foundation of New France, and really the fabric of modern North America, wasn't just built by European men planting flags on a shoreline or signing treaties in palaces back in Europe.
No, it was intrinsically built on the shared resilience and the intertwined lives of indigenous peoples and colonists.
Marie-Olivier navigated the intense geopolitical pressures of her childhood, absorbed a foreign education without losing her soul, and forged a frontier marriage that wove two clashing civilizations into a single enduring bloodline.
She wasn't just a bystander to history, she was the mechanism that made the future possible.
She took the fragmented, warring pieces of her world and literally built a bridge out of her own life.
Which is incredible. And it leaves us with this final thought for you to mull over as we wrap up. Our history books traditionally love to focus on the men who fought the battles, the guys who explored the rivers and drafted the laws.
Right, the typical founders.
Exactly. But what if the true founders of our modern nations are actually the women? The women who managed the daily, agonizing translation of two entirely different cultures at the dinner table, in the fields, and in the raising of the next generation.
That changes the whole perspective.
It really does. How would our view of modern history change if we always centered their stories? Next time you look at a family tree, don't just see a neat grid of names. Look for the frontier it took to draw those lines. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.